The development of this podcast was sponsored by Alexion Pharmaceuticals Incorporated. The viewpoints expressed are those of the person speaking and not of Alexion. Welcome to NMOSD Your Way Global, an educational podcast series for NMOSD patients worldwide. NMOSD stands for Neuromyelitis Optica Spectrum Disorder, a rare relapsing autoimmune disorder of the central nervous system which primarily affects the optic nerves and the spinal cord. Your podcast hosts Lalania Lloyd and Debbie Latique, who have both lived with NMOSD for over 10 years, will be bringing their respective Canadian and Australian perspectives to the table in order to help patients worldwide better understand NMOSD. Over the next 16 episodes, clinicians, researchers, and fellow patients will come together to have important conversations about how to live your best life within your diagnosis. They will be offering up encouragement and practical tips for overall health and well-being. In this episode, Debbie talks with Dr. Therese Burke, a multiple sclerosis certified nurse, about taking back control. So, let's get started.
Hi everyone, I'm your host Debbie Latique, and I was diagnosed with a rare neuro-immunological condition called Neuromyelitis Optica Spectrum Disorder. It's a bit of a mouthful, 10 years ago. An NMOSD diagnosis can be life-changing, and with it comes some unique challenges. Today I talk to Dr. Therese Burke, who is a multiple sclerosis certified nurse, MSCN, and adjunct senior research fellow in the School of Nursing at the University of Notre Dame in Sydney, Australia. Therese has devoted a great deal of her time and passion to understanding what people living with NMOSD experience. And today she shares some of her wisdom about how people with this diagnosis can take back control of their lives. Hi Therese, welcome to the podcast. I'm so excited to chat with you today. You have been working with people living with neuroimmune conditions for many years. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself and your experience with NMOSD?
Yeah, I certainly can. So firstly, thank you, Debbie, for inviting me to talk to you today. I'm really happy that we get a chance to talk about a lot of things that often don't get spoken about in medical and nursing care, and hopefully our listeners can go away today feeling a lot more confidence and feeling a bit empowered. So as for me, as you mentioned, I've been working as an MS nurse for a long time, back in the early 2000s, and been working in immunology most of my career. But some really interesting things happened to me early on in MS. The first was that I shared my office with a neuro-immunologist, and that was a doctor who was a neurologist but also had immunology training, which was quite unique back then. And so he was onto NMO and the new things that were happening around it very early. So I was privy to that very early information about it and became interested. I also had my office next door to a scientist who was the person doing the very initial NMOSD testing in Australia. And he was a lovely bloke and he was very patient-centric. So he used to often pop into me and say, can you find out more information about these patients I'm getting the tests for? I want to understand more about it, which was incredible. So he'd have me ringing up the people that sent the test to ask about the symptoms and how the patient was. So I got to make a lot of contacts with people seeing NMO patients early. And then we had a fellow doing their training. So that's somebody training to be a neurologist in almost their final year. And she was extremely interested in NMO and in fact has gone on to be quite an international expert in NMOSD and MOGAD. And she came to us for her last year of training and would always ask the question, could this be NMO if it was something difficult? So I guess I had this apprenticeship like no other, where I was there early and I had people who were passionate about finding out more about this disease, and that just filtered to me, and we became a team and started looking after people with NMOSD more frequently.
How very fortunate that you've had that background.
Oh, it was just Therese. Luck on every front, and I'm thankful every day because of the people I got to meet because of it.
I spoke with Dr. Leslie Ann Hall, a neurologist, in one of our episodes in detail about what NMOSD is. But in layman's terms, could you clarify what NMOSD is?
Yeah, sure. Look, it's a very complex disease and it's very difficult to explain. So I know the medical and scientific terminology sometimes makes it sound very difficult to sort of get down into terms. And for a lot of people, they may have previously been diagnosed with MS or something like MS. And so coming to terms with what it actually means can be very challenging. But what it is firstly I'm going to explain about aquaporin 4. So that's a protein that we all have in our bodies, and it helps with the conduction of water across cell membranes. It's a water channel. And it's in certain parts of the brain and spinal cord where we have lots of water channels. And that's usually in areas that are very highly vascular. And that's the optic nerve, the spinal cord, and area post-rema. And I'll talk about that in a little minute. So that's what aquaporin 4 is, just a protein we all have in our bodies. Antibodies, on the other hand, they're what we fight against infection and foreign invaders. And I guess a lot of people didn't know what antibodies were until COVID. And certainly in the last 2 years, people are a lot more aware that we develop antibodies in response to a threat to our body, which is usually a virus or bacteria. Now, in NMOSD, for reasons that we don't understand yet, something happens to make the body mistakenly take aquaporin 4 as a foreign invader, like a virus or a bacteria. And so the body develops antibodies against aquaporin 4, and it sees antibodies that go in to do the fighting against the foreign invader, which actually isn't there, and creates all of the damage because it sets up this chemical process that happens around the cells that just cascades. And that's what causes the incredible damage that happens around those astrocytes that are located in those areas we talked about. And we'll go into that in a little bit more depth in a minute.
Can I ask you, Therese, I heard that about 75% of patients test positive to aquaporin 4, but there's about 25% that don't. Can you explain just briefly what that means? Or
we don't know why. Yeah, but you're right. So, and that's a seropositive. So people will be told they might be seropositive, seropositive, which means that the antibodies show up in their blood, but you're right, about 1/4 or 25% are seronegative and they don't show up even though they do most likely have the disease. And
I also believe that we used to refer to it as NMO, and now it's a spectrum disorder. So that kind of covers a much broader range and spectrum of disease, doesn't it?
It does. And that's one of the things I was going to talk about next, is that it does cover so much because it depends on where the area of damage happens. So much as to how NMO presents and where those water channels are damaged. And as I mentioned, that can be the optic nerves, so that can lead to problems with vision, which could be vision loss. It could be loss of colour saturation. It could also affect the spinal cord in many ways, depending on whereabouts on the spinal cord the damage is, because it's usually below with the myelitis. The level of myelitis will be the damage below. So if that's up quite high, it could be very different symptoms to if that was down lower in the spinal cord. And the third area is a really interesting one called area post-rema. Now, that's an area in the medulla, which is in the brainstem, which connects the brain is at the top, the spinal cord then goes at the back, medulla's in the middle. Now, this area has lots of sensory neurons in it, and it has control. It's looking at control of hormones and all sorts of things, and it's actually where the vomiting centre is. So some people present with hiccups and nausea and vomiting symptoms, but might have symptoms in no other area. So there's quite an array of ways that it can present.
It sounds really challenging for many people with NMOSD. Can you tell us what some of your patients have faced?
Yeah, well, based on what I just said with all the different presentations, I've seen pretty much everything, Deb. So I've had someone who's just presented with 3 or 4 days of hiccups, presented to emergency because they didn't know what else to do. Took a little while for that to be worked out, that was NMOSD, but that was how that presentation happened. And then I've had other people that have had more challenging paths where they've lost mobility, they've had major issues with bowel and bladder and sexual health function, and I've had other people that have had very significant periods of blindness, which is incredibly scary as well. So there can be many different presentations, and as you said, it's challenging to diagnose because of that. But I think more recently, probably in the last 5 years, there's been a lot more awareness of NMOSD, and so things are improving greatly on that front.
Yes, definitely. I've seen that over the last 10 years. It's incredible how far we've come in that time, and especially the last 2 to 5 years. I think it's been terrific, the advances that have taken place.
Yeah, I agree. And just to see the interest, Deb, has been incredible, because in the MS world now, you can't go to any major MS medical or scientific meeting without a significant part of the meeting being devoted to NMOSD, which is incredible to see. And so that means our understanding all over the world is increasing. And as our new doctors are coming in, they're learning that from the get-go. So things can only get better.
At the time of my diagnosis, which took 6 to 12 months in the end, I was, a 50-year-old, healthy, happy mum of 2 teenage children, full-time teacher. I taught music, drug ed, sexuality education. I was a volunteer firefighter. I was a lieutenant in the fire brigade, heading towards hopefully being the first captain on the hilltop. And I drove the big red fire trucks, and life was just joyous, and happily married as well at the time. And so it came out of the blue for me. I just woke up one morning with a massive headache in the temple, and as it turned out, that the headache lasted for about 3 months in the same spot, right-hand temple. And I also woke up with what I found out later was an MS type hug, or NMO hug, where the muscles contract in the intercostal space, and that's what I found out later. And by the end of that day, I was in hospital, 1 minute standing and the next minute in a wheelchair. I got weaker and weaker. Let's do a couple of tests and send you home. And that's what happened to me. And so I went to see my GP the next day. Same thing happened. Things started turning off. My legs started turning off. I started getting double vision, blurred vision, double vision, eyes jumping up and down. So all these strange and weird symptoms came out of the blue. And I think that's what's so strange, is when you're so healthy and then suddenly you get these weird symptoms, you start thinking, is this all in the mind? What's going on? But intrinsically, I knew that I trusted my own instincts in my body. Unfortunately, my first neurologist that I was sent to, they did tests and didn't find any lesions. And so I felt like I wasn't believed to start with. And that was really, really difficult. My neurologist at the time wanted to send me to a psychiatrist to rule out other conditions. Now, I understand that, but I also felt really that feeling of living in limbo and not being believed was very traumatic for me. And so I think that's why I've become such a passionate advocate. And so I went to the psychiatrist. Basically to prove them wrong, because I knew my own body. And I think that's really important for people to understand, that you need to trust your own instincts. And I found a fantastic neurologist who looked at the original MRIs and couldn't believe it. He could actually see the lesion up in the C2. They repeated the MRI and confirmed. So I was initially diagnosed with transverse myelitis. It wasn't until another 6 months later that they changed it to NMO. And honestly, it was, that living in limbo and the unpredictability was the hardest challenge that I've ever faced. Going from being a person totally in control to a person out of control, not knowing from 1 hour to day what was happening. So I'm so glad I found a fantastic health practitioner. I was then referred, and also knowing that I had an answer was the first step in taking back control. And I know how difficult it was for my children and husband, as my carers. They could see their active mum deteriorating before their eyes. So, the marriage did disintegrate, and that was because of NMOSD. But I survived it, and my family survived it, and we're still here to tell the tale. And living with that unpredictable, and from hourly, it can change hourly. Even now, for me, it does. And knowing that you've got an unknown future. So I really hit rock bottom. You couldn't get any lower. And I was contemplating life in a wheelchair on the drug that I was given. It just stopped working. Anyway, so I took back control, and I did it. I went berserk. I got a timetable out, typical teacher, and I started writing in things that I was going to do every day. And one of the things that I really wanted, because my legs were weak, I needed to take control of my physical exercise and my mental my mental health as well. So I did go berserk to start with, and I fatigue was something that I just wasn't used to. It was a foreign word to me. And fatigue is one of those things that you can't really explain to someone unless, it gets to the point where you simply can't speak and you can't move, that kind of fatigue. So anyway, my first step after diagnosis, was actually seeking the help of an MS psychologist. And it was she, Dr. Sally Shaw, who I spoke to in the last episode, and she unlocked the key to living with purpose again, because all of a sudden I had no purpose. I'd lost my job as a teacher. I didn't lose it. I walked away from 30 years of teaching, walked away from a marriage, walked away from my volunteer work, and really there was not a great deal left. But finding that key and finding the person that you can relate to, and that they believed you, and they stood me in good stead for moving forward. I'm forever grateful for that, because that really helped me to move forward. I worked on finding a purpose again, and I then started journaling my experience, both physically and mentally, and that was really good. And I also did a video for my friends and family. So when I was actually having a bad day, or I was really weak, or I was having an actual attack, my daughter, my brave daughter, who's now a gorgeous ED nurse, she videoed me having an actual attack. Very confronting. But after that, my friends and family really understood about the invisibility of the disease. So, and then I just concentrated on what I could do, not what I couldn't do. And I learnt to pace myself. And then I set daily routines of exercise, yoga, meditation, and then I learnt learning new skills. So I started, learning to paint and draw and be creative and get involved with social activities and start my own four-wheel drive and camping club. All the while concentrating on what I could do, not what I couldn't do. And once I look at myself as reinventing myself to suit my NMO circumstances.
Rather than the other way around.
Rather than the other way around.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. And part of that is the grief, though. You have to go through the grieving of your old life. You're still you inside. You're still the same person. You've got different circumstances, and you've just got to find yourself. It sounds a bit cliche, but you find yourself again. And I decided I wanted to give back to the NMOSD community, and I think that was really important for me too. So once I'd got control of my own symptoms and life, and I'd already done my grieving, and I had accepted where I was at, I just didn't want others to go through and feel so alone. And I hosted my first NMOSD conference in Melbourne in 2017, and I had, expert speakers from America, Dr. Levy, and I had my neurologist and Sally Shaw, and we had people from all around Australia come and unite. And it was the first ever in Australia, and it was just fantastic. We weren't alone anymore. Yeah. So, and then I thought, what's the next thing I can do? So I bought an off-road caravan and I decided to travel solo around Australia. I did 20,000 kilometres, and it was my purpose to actually visit some people with NMOSD that I'd met on our support Facebook group. Wow. And I did have attacks and flare-ups on the journey. I dragged myself up into the caravan on a couple of occasions and turned the video on in case someone found me. I was taken by ambulance one time so I could get some steroids, some things like that. But I still kept going. Nothing was going to stop me. And I made it, and I met some fantastic people face to face, and I think I learned a lot from visiting other people and helping other people. Then I came back and I did it as a fundraiser for research into NMO. That was one of my purposes. And then I joined a mentor program and became a peer support mentor. And I took lots of opportunities to have a voice as a patient advocate, participating in surveys and workshops and webinars and things like that. So once again, making sure that I had a voice, and that was important to me. I became an administrator of the NMOSD Facebook page for Aussies, along with Rebecca, who was fantastic in supporting me when I was first diagnosed. And then I just started my own four-wheel drive and camping club. My whole life changed. I met new people, met other people that had come from, not so good backgrounds, that had been traumatised as well with various things in their life. And I learnt to love me again, because I actually I just didn't love me. I had forgotten how to love myself and put myself first. We're so used to being a carer for our family when we're a mum. And I just learnt to, after pacing myself, to just not plan anything. And I think that's really hard as a teacher, not to plan anything, because you live for the next school holidays.
Absolutely.
And I just learnt to live in the now, which was one of the hardest things I learnt, but it's been the most precious and amazing experience to live in the now. I survived it. I was stronger mentally than ever. I became kinder, more empathetic and grateful. I'm so, so grateful. I wouldn't wish NMOSD on anyone, but it has given me a much greater understanding and depth in my life. And I've never played the victim. I've never said, why me? I've always said, why not me? And in effect, NMOSD has really cleaned up my life. And
wow, I can feel a book coming on here, Deb. There needs to be a book.
A lot of people have said that. I just haven't got time to do it yet.
Because of it. There's so much in that story, Deb, that is supported by research. You will be happy to know. You could have been a one-man show research project. A lot of my research with the lived experience of demyelinating disorders, you have pulled on those factors that seem to be really important for people taking back control of their lives. And look, and by taking back control, we don't mean controlling everything. We don't mean being a controller or anything like that. It's just trying to gain back some of the power and confidence that you lost by having to deal with a disease that just takes so much. And as you beautifully pointed out, Deb, there were so many losses, and they weren't just in one domain, they were across the whole spectrum of your life. And so you had all those losses. For those that are newly diagnosed, I did want to ask you before I go on to some more things, how long has that process been, Deb, from when you had your first attack to now, where you can stand up and say to the world, this is what's happened, but this is what I am? How long has that taken you?
Look, I think it took me, the first 2 years was the grieving. Yeah. That was the hardest part. From about 2 years on, I think, so for the last 8 years, 5 to 8 years, I've found myself, found my voice. So the first couple of years is quite, it's different. It can be challenging but there is hope. And I think that's the thing. The key is that there is always hope, and there's partial recovery, if not full recovery with some of us as well, and in between having flare-ups and attacks.
Yeah. And I think that's important. And I know from Sally's previous talk, she did a really deep dive into the thoughts and processes behind taking back control from a psychologist's point of view. The things that I'm going to talk about are more just from a nurse point of view and just more general things that you can do for your well-being, and tips about how I really saw people taking big steps. And you've hit on so many of them. Things like giving back. That's been proven through research to be really important in helping people get back on track. And you've demonstrated that in so many ways. Finding meaning, trying to find meaning in what they're doing and thinking, well, look, if I can't do that, what can I do? Finding your North Star, finding the things that are really important to you and really make your heart sing. And as you mentioned, sometimes it's surprising what those things are. They might be things you've never considered before, like journaling and doing creative stuff, but finding what's important to you. And so a lot of the things you did would be exactly my tips. So my top ones are to be honest and be upfront, particularly with those that love you, because they need to know what's happening. And the way you did that video, I haven't heard of that being done before, but that's an amazing tool to help you get back on that great track. And so I'm really glad you mentioned that, because I think that will help a lot of people, because that's such a difficult thing to explain. And a lot of those invisible symptoms are so hard for others. Even though they really want to understand, it's really hard for them to get a grip on what that means. My second tip is to be very kind to yourself all the time, not just some days, not just next week, not just when things get better. Be kind to yourself. This is for those that are newly diagnosed. So much is happening in such a short period of time in the beginning. It's almost impossible to get a grip on it all. So we'll just do things one step at a time. But be kind to yourself and give yourself some grace. Be persistent. If you're not happy or you don't feel like things are where they should be, or you're not getting the right answers, or people aren't paying attention, be persistent. And your resilience showed through there, Deb, with how you knew that something was wrong. And a lot of people tell me that they just knew deep down something wasn't right, and they continued to seek help until they found the help that they needed. I used to also have rehearsals with people. So with patients, for difficult concepts, I would sometimes rehearse with them how they might explain that to their family, which works in beautifully, I think, with the video concept too. So don't be scared to, perhaps with a trusted friend or a family member, just even practice how you might say things, so that if when you go back to work or whatever the case might be, because sometimes that gives you confidence too, because you've had a little bit of a practice about how that might go. And paying attention to your warning signs. As you said, you got to work out very quickly what you could and couldn't do, particularly with things like fatigue, and managing all those other symptoms. Write down your questions. You know, you can't, sometimes going away from an appointment with, a medical appointment can leave you feeling a bit down if things weren't covered or you felt like things didn't get answered properly. So have your questions to go in with, and that often gives you a lot more confidence too. So, and that can be an important part about taking control. And of course, my top tip is just to harness your support network, whatever that's going to look like. And that will be very different for everybody. For some people, it might be a big band of friends. For other people, it might be their spouse or their closest family. There's all different types of support networks, and I know we're going to talk about some of those in more detail.
Fantastic. There's some really good tips there, Therese. Thank you. You've talked to me about making sure you have the right sort of support networks, yes. But what happens if you don't have family or friends that you can turn to?
Yeah, and this is sadly the case for some people, but the good news is that there's a lot of advocacy support groups out there now, and these groups have grown, particularly over the last decade, as you've seen yourself, and you've been probably instrumental in some of these getting off the ground. But often, I think once there was the advent of these support groups, I could see the difference clinically when I saw patients, because they got to be in touch with someone who was like them, that understood a lot of the concepts that were so foreign to other people when they tried to explain them. So I think those support groups can be a really great source of not just support, but validation, and being believed and being understood, and knowing that you're talking to people that have been through like experiences. They're probably not the same experience because there's, as we talked about, so many different ways that it can present, but someone who understands what that uncertainty and unpredictability feels like. And for other people, that could be a bit more spread out. It might not be NMOSD particularly, but it could be in a neurological support group. Or something like that, or even a chronic illness support group. So there's different strokes out there for different folks. So don't be scared to try more than one if you feel like your first foray into it isn't what you expected. It might just not be the one for you, but there will be one there that suits exactly what you need.
Exactly, and that can take some time, can't it, to find that right support network.
Yeah, and I think globally now, Deb, with everything that's happened with the pandemic, with Zoom and the advent of all these other things, it's going to be easier to even connect with people overseas that might be the right person for you. So there's lots of things in that space happening.
So finally, Therese, where can our listeners go to find some of these resources that we've been talking about?
Well, this is a really good news, Deb. As you touched on before, a decade ago, there was barely anything written that could help people get through, particularly that newly diagnosed period where it's really challenging, but then living well with NMOSD forever also needs some support and help. But now there is just so much available, and different sorts of resources will suit different people according to how they learn and what they want to know, whether they want to be more technical, whether they want more warmth from their interactions. But certainly connecting with others with NMOSD, we've seen, is a really important part of recovery and living well. So the Facebook forums, talking to peers, finding out tips from them about people that have been really helpful, particularly with healthcare professionals and allied health, seems to work amazingly well. And then there's basic websites like the Guthrie-Jackson Foundation, the Samara Foundation, but it's important to find out what's going to work for you and what you like, and then you can stick with. And that might change over the journey too. In the beginning, when you're newly diagnosed, you might want a plethora of information and you might go to lots of different websites. But this can be a double-edged sword because there's so much information out there now compared to a decade ago that whilst there's all that good with it, it can be overwhelming. So just tread carefully, go slowly, and work out what fits you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Therese, for sharing your wisdom with us today. And to our listeners, I hope you found some useful advice that can help you navigate your NMOSD journey. And you will join us for our next episode. Let's chat NMOSD soon.
We hope you have enjoyed listening to this NMOSD Your Way Global podcast. For more information about NMOSD and access to support and resources, please read the podcast description. What you have heard in this podcast may not be reflective of your own experience and does not replace the advice of a healthcare professional. If you have any concerns or specific questions about NMOSD, please speak to your physician.